Good morning, and thanks for joining this event. My name is Kirk Bowman from the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs here at Georgia Tech. And on behalf of the school and the School of Public Policy, we want to thank our sponsor, which is the Meg and Sam Flax Speaker Series. And we're really delighted and honored to have Michelle Nunn with us today. I've been following Michelle Nunn for a long time as I've been researching and working on philanthropy. And I'm especially delighted with her career that spans both the smaller neighborhood and community organizations, as she was the founder of Hands On Atlanta, and now she's at a much larger global organization, which is CARE. So I'm going to let her talk a little bit about her experience and how she found her calling to enter into this field, and a little bit about her journey from Hands On Atlanta to CARE.
Great, Kirk, it's great to be with you, and it's great to be with always the Georgia Tech students, and just to be a part of, obviously, the Sam Nunn School, which we have a lot of time for in our family, as you can imagine. And I think that my parents might be on, or at least one of them. So maybe we'll ask them for a cameo appearance at some point. I would say that I was influenced by my parents in terms of their public service commitments, and loved volunteering and serving. And when I graduated from college, I knew I wanted to make a difference, but I knew I wanted to be involved in the broadest sense in service, but really did not know what that looked like. And I was lucky enough to meet the people that were starting Hands On Atlanta, and at that point, they had raised enough money by passing around beer mugs at Manuel's Tavern to start to print up their own T-shirts, and somebody gave them $2,500, and they decided it was time to hire a staff person. So I became that glorified intern / executive director, working 10 hours a week, and fell in love with leading a community-based organization. As you said, it's a great privilege to be a part of something that is very much rooted in community and in direct service, and loved that work, and helped grow it along with a lot of other people into not only a civic hub here in Atlanta, but something that expanded to multiple cities across the country, and actually even around the world. We had Hands On Memphis and Nashville and Manila, and then eventually we merged with President George H.W. Bush's Points of Light organization, which as a very different founding story, was founded at Camp David with a group of CEOs, but yet we came together and became the largest organization dedicated to volunteer service. And then I have had the opportunity to run for office, even albeit unsuccessfully, and then found my way to CARE, and really a lifelong interest in and commitment to defeating poverty, and also to lifting up women and girls, which is the heart of CARE's mission. So it's been a wonderful journey, and one that I'm really grateful for, with a lot of serendipity.
Thanks, Michelle. I wonder if you could spend a little bit more time talking about that mission of empowering girls and women, and specifically what CARE sees as the role it can play in that sector.
Yeah, so CARE has been operating for 75 years. We're actually celebrating our 75th anniversary of the delivery of the first CARE packages on May the 11th. And over those many years and decades of experience, one thing that we've learned, among others, is that when you invest in women and girls, that you have a disproportionate impact on families and on communities and on nations, really. And so we've come to know that we can't achieve the defeat of poverty until we achieve gender equality. And so, and that, that manifests in all sorts of ways. We know that when girls have the opportunity to graduate from high school, their economic return over a lifetime is exponential. How their family fares is completely on a different trajectory. Families have children born to women who have had the chance to go through secondary school are twice or more as likely to live to the age of 5. And we just know that it makes good sense from a livelihood, community-based perspective, and also from the perspective of national economies. McKinsey and others have done studies that talk about literally the trillions of additional dollars that go into the economy as we move forward towards greater gender. In CARE's work, we do that in a variety of ways. We make sure that we consider the needs of women and girls throughout all of our work. So that means, for instance, when we do emergency relief work, which is still very much a part of our mission, that we look at it from a gender lens. Over the last year, CARE has done over 50 what we call rapid gender assessments to see how COVID was impacting women and girls in particular. We see that women are losing their rates of livelihood in Bangladesh at something like 6 times more than men, as an example. We also can see the disproportionate impact that COVID is having from the perspective of the burden of care, the responsibility of care, where we know that women work literally more hours in the home around caregiving duties, and that has only increased. We see, for instance, the impact of gender-based violence. We know that for every additional month of quarantine, we could see up to 5 million more additional cases of gender-based violence. So there are really important ways in which we have to look through the lens of gender in order to ensure that our engagement and intervention on everything from smallholder agriculture to emergency assistance to health systems are working for women and girls.
Okay. Typically in development, global philanthropy, innovation, a lot of things start in the United States or Europe and then spread abroad. And there's something really interesting at CARE where it seems like CARE is taking some of the lessons it's learned in its 75 years abroad and applying some of those to missions in the United States. So I was curious about what kind of lessons and what kind of programs that CARE is now developing in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think one of the things that we've learned is that there are really important solutions that are coming from everywhere around the world, and that it's really an opportunity for us to learn. In fact, if you look at rates of poverty, they've been almost cut in half if you look at global rates of poverty, and yet stubbornly stagnating here in the United States. And so, yeah, just over a year ago, for the first time, CARE decided that we wanted to take some of those lessons and apply them here in the U.S. As one example, here there was a group of women in Niger almost 30 years ago that started what we call our Village Savings and Loan Program. It's simply a savings group that those first women came together, met on a weekly basis, saved money each week, and then lent it out to one another to start small businesses or to support one another if there was an issue of a health concern with the family. There's a safety net dimension to it as well. That program has expanded to almost 10 million women now in over 50 different countries. And they save almost $500 million, more than $500 million every year. And so it's been tremendously successful. We've seen, for instance, in Niger, where it started, half of the women that have been elected to political office have come through a savings group. So we are now starting some pilot groups here in the U.S. for the first time to take that model of a savings group and apply it here in the U.S. We know that for close to half of the families in the United States, they can't afford a $400 emergency. So the idea of creating a safety net and solidarity groups is one that we think has some value here. So that's one example of the way that CARE is thinking about this. There's a lot of other things that we will be looking to down the line. Issues of maternal mortality as an example. How countries use community health workers to support better health for especially for what we call last mile or for rural communities. So those are some of the things that we'll be looking to, and I think the idea of how are we learning together and applying the best solutions wherever we are, that are locally contextualized and that work, but we can learn and truly have the opportunity to scale through a global platform like CARE here in the U.S. and we have plenty to learn.
Thank you. I mainly studied in Latin America, and I saw a report from the World Bank that 50 million people are going to go into poverty in Latin America. You know, this tenuous middle class that's been just knocked down from COVID. So I'm curious, and a lot of large nonprofits like the Ford Foundation, they've really changed some of their strategies because of the predicament for poor people and the lower middle class that is really in trouble. And I'm curious, how is CARE thinking about the way that the pandemic will alter how the CARE works?
Yeah, well, it's such a big question, such an important question. And as you say, I think after decades of progress on some of these indicators, hunger, poverty as an example, we're starting to see regression, and I think we really have to be vigilant as we stand up to the challenges of COVID, but also some of those secondary dimensions of COVID, which have been economic devastation in places like Latin America. I have a colleague and a good friend who both as herself as an activist and change agent and as her parent said that over the last year, basically 2 generations of work has been washed away. And so we have to find ways of, I think, reclaiming the capacity for progress there. I think it's going to take a variety of things. One is it's going to take, I think, a real focus on resourcing the challenges. So one dimension of it is, first of all, we have to ensure that we are defeating the pandemic at a global level. So as the U.S. focuses attention, rightly so, on ensuring that our own populace is vaccinated, we can't lose sight that truly, you know, this sort of truism of no one is safe until everyone is safe has never been more true than in a situation of a global pandemic. And if you listen to Dr. Fauci and when asked what is the biggest thing that concerns him, it is the emergence of variants where we do not address the ensure the vaccine and the defeat of the disease happens everywhere. And we're seeing that all over the world right now in dangerous situations. Our colleagues right now are scrambling in India to really deal with a devastating situation in terms of the spread of COVID and based upon variants. So I think we have to address that, because also what is happening is those, as you say, lower and middle income countries cannot put forward trillions of dollars to invest, as the U.S. has been lucky enough to do, to ensure that they can move through this economically. So we absolutely, both from a health and values and humanitarian perspective, have to do this, but also from an economic perspective, we can't afford for our global GDP and also the actually economic trajectories of low and middle income countries to be devastated, and therefore for people to fall below the safety line. So we have to get at some of those root causes. In the meantime, we also have to be able to address the humanitarian concerns. So there are now what we call type 4 sort of emergency situations in a variety of different countries that CARE is working in Yemen and South Sudan and Somalia. It's hard for the world to turn its attention to those. I doubt that many of us are seeing every day what's happening in Yemen or what's happening in South Sudan and Somalia. But we are going to have to lift up our emergency response and our humanitarian response to what is anticipated to be a 40% increase this year in humanitarian need. And then I think we do have to then continue to turn our attention to what are the sustainable strategies that will help defeat poverty over the long term. But we have to make sure that some of these building blocks are in place in order for us to, I think, move successfully through this coming year, both for the short, mid, and long term.
I have the privilege of working with a lot of students at Georgia Tech on community development projects, and they have a real desire to think about this as a career, but it's a really difficult career path to manage and plan in this sector. And I was wondering what advice you would give to students about the types of experiences and skills that would best prepare them to both make an impact and make a living in this sector.
Yeah, it is a challenging but also really rewarding path, and so I would encourage people to walk down the path. I would say that it is helpful, I think, to be armed not only with content knowledge about development and about sort of programmatic dimensions, but you could also think about how are you equipping yourself with the skills that can help organizations to address those content issues in really smart and strategic and scaled ways. So we have some folks that have chosen to do that by becoming consultants for a few years and then taking those skills and tools that they use from the private sector and being able to apply them into the civic and public sectors. I think that's really useful. And there are also all sorts of tools. We need technology. We need digital visionaries to join us. I think it is sometimes hard to compete with the private sector in that regard, but if you think about the importance of applying new generations of technology to actually the betterment of humankind, that's a really powerful set of possibilities, and we need great people who bring those technical skills at places like CARE or smaller organizations as well. So I would encourage people to think about getting some of those skills that you might call sort of technical, whether it's marketing, communication, whether it's technology, or whether it is the capacity to help on strategic planning. Those are really highly in demand in nonprofits. I think having some early experiences that are global and international, and because I think that is also really important. Languages, as someone who did not successfully school myself in languages, I would definitely recommend that. That's an incredibly important asset and valuable set of tools to bring to whatever it is that you're doing. And then I would just say an openness and intellectual curiosity to let there be a little bit of serendipity in your path. I often talk to young people who I think feel like they have to have the 30-year plan, and I don't know many older folks like me who actually realistically had it all laid out.
Okay. There's reports of some nonprofit organizations having low morale in its workforce, and this tension between what the work is that is done for the organization and what the work is that's done for the mission itself. And as someone running a really large and dynamic organization, how do you balance that tension between the time and energy that goes in to building CARE and the time and money that goes into building the mission? And how do you, prioritize or reward the people in CARE to really feel that they're part of the mission and not building the organization?
Yeah. Well, it's an important question. I think we always want to keep the sightline on the delivery against the mission and whether the institution building that we're doing is actually enabling us to fulfill our mission or to extend our mission. And so, I do think I think reminding people that some people who might come into a nonprofit might think, well, unless I'm doing the frontline work, I'm not really contributing to the mission. But there's a whole set of enabling dimensions to an organization that equip the organization to be able to deliver against the mission. And not everybody is going to be on the front lines. And frankly, organizations like CARE, 95% of our staff are from the places they're serving. So, they're from Afghanistan, they're from Haiti. And so those of us who are raising money in the U.S. may not feel that it may not be exactly what we had in mind when we grew up and said we want to change the world, but it is a part of a larger whole that is enabling us, for instance, to deliver 1.5 million kind of gifts of food and packages of support to the people of Yemen every single month, as an example right now. So I try and remind our team that we're all a part of this collective mission, and that there's a lot of dependencies, and that we're dependent upon our internal audit team to ensure that we have the compliance to deliver against our mission. If that breaks down, everything else breaks down with it, and so we're all hopefully greater than the sum of our parts. I think there's two dimensions to your question from my perspective. One is the important and necessary work of building an organization that enables the delivery of a mission. And then the second question is and how do you make everybody feel a part of that? The second question is, do you sometimes perpetuate an organization or extend an organization beyond its best ability to contribute and get into organization building versus mission delivery? And that's a bit different, and that gets into, are you collaborating where you should? Are you doing things that others might be able to do better? As an international NGO, are we enabling local civil society? Are we displacing it? So those are important questions that I think we have to ask ourselves every day.
Yeah, a lot of those questions are the same that we go through at universities, right? About having activities and even jobs that we're not sure exactly how they fit in with the mission, but we see where they fit in with the organization, and there's a little bit of tension there. You mentioned Yemen, and you mentioned some of these places that CARE does such important work, and I wonder if you could give us a couple of words of optimism. Sometimes we are so cynical, and we look at the world and we see the pandemic, and we see the intractable war in Yemen, and we see all of the suffering. And you're someone that deals with that all the time. And, it must be incredible to see also these positive stories that really inspire you. So I wonder if you could give us a little bit of something romantic or positive or exciting or, hopeful about the world that we live in right now.
Yeah. Well, I think when you go to the most challenging places in the world, what you see is the most extraordinary manifestation of the human spirit. And so I would say that whenever I'm able to go to see CARE's work, I find it to be an extraordinary inspiration. And so, as examples, I would say I just got a note from a colleague in India about a community health worker there who was describing both her fear at being on the front lines in a pandemic at COVID, but also sort of saying, she basically said, "But nothing will stop me," was the quote. And so, a recognition of fear and vulnerability and a declaration of service and commitment. And that's the spirit that I see in frontline health workers everywhere around the world. I mean, and we're all seeing that every time we go to, I just got my second shot at Walmart, from a technician whose name was Ali, who, when I thanked him, he said, "We're saving the world one person at a time." He said that his cousin in Pakistan, where he's originally from, had died of COVID, but he was going to do his part where he was And I think there are millions of people that are doing that every single day. And when you step back and look at that, it really is inspiration. I think about the women in West Africa who CARE works with, one of whom was speaking of the difficulties that her VSLA, her savings group, was facing. They had all lost their livelihoods, the capacity to go to the markets to sell their goods. They were working together to inform their community about how to stop the spread of COVID through information. And they were also raising dollars themselves for supporting families that were unable to feed themselves at this incredibly difficult time. And these are women that are already living in poverty. And they, one of them declared at the end of their session, "Impossible is not for us." And so that's the spirit that I take heart in, and that I think we can all take some sense of inspiration from.
Thanks. I could chat with Michelle for hours, but I'd like to invite all of you to submit your questions also. And we have one here. You spoke earlier about how domestic violence against women has increased with quarantines due to COVID. How does CARE address issues facing women that are unreported and often unknown?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue here in the U.S. and around the world. And again, we've seen similar trends around the world in terms of the increase of gender-based violence and domestic gender-based violence. And it is, as is noted, very difficult to be able to even really track and mark what is happening in terms of so many that go unreported. CARE works at a variety of different levels around this. One of the advocacy points was just to ensure that during, for instance, those early months of COVID, that we didn't shut down gender-based violence hotlines, that we ensured that we had those capacities were both funded and enabled to continue to work at a time when they could have been relegated, but in which time they were also more important than perhaps was initially even going to be recognized. So I think one is just to ensure that we put in place some of the basics around resources and capacities. Two is that we support local civil society organizations, especially feminist and women-led organizations, local community-based organizations, because they are in the best position to create influence. A third dimension is we work on the social norms. We work with men and boys on understanding sort of issues of gender equality, and stepping back. And again, in the savings groups that we work with, we often bring in spouses and talk about equitable distribution of labor within the family, the injury of gender-based violence. So there's a whole set of gender norm work that we do, and we do that with faith institutions, but very much at a very local level. And then, I think we also look to influence governments around recognizing there's the legislative dimension of this, is making sure that the issues of sexual harassment and gender-based violence are recognized within law, but then again, you have to make sure that those laws are then implemented and executed. So this isn't domestic violence, but in places, for instance, in the garment industry where we work, in places like Vietnam and Bangladesh, we do a lot of work with both businesses, corporations, women, and families to identify these issues, make sure that that women themselves are equipped to lift up their voice in really important ways to actually stand up against gender-based violence.
As we travel around, a lot of times people ask where we're from, and we identify these iconic or these large, well-known businesses like Delta and UPS, and we're proud of having it. And we're also proud that we have CARE, because it's also one of these names that everyone knows in the world. How did CARE end up in Atlanta?
Yeah, CARE. So CARE was founded with just a handful of people who said we're not going to sit on the sidelines and watch people face starvation in post-World War II Europe. They figured out how to get 20,000 care packages within a few months to be shipped from from Philly to Le Havre, France. And that was in New York. And so for the first almost 50 years of CARE's work, it was headquartered in New York. And so I lost track now, but it's been more than 25 years. It's between 25 and 30 years ago. I think CARE started to consider whether the price of doing business in New York was sustainable. And we had as you all know, as Atlantans, I'm sure many of you know the influence of the Woodruff Foundation. And the Woodruff Foundation, I think, invested in a building that CARE still owns and operates in downtown Atlanta on Ellis Street, and kind of enticed CARE to come to Atlanta. And I think the attraction was the ecosystem of global public health. If you think about the CDC and EMRI and the task force now for global health, Hartsfield, Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, which helps a lot, and then I think this sort of civic spirit of pride around what Woodruff did was invest in a series of national and international nonprofits to come to Atlanta.
I have another question from the audience. CARE has a global footprint. Who decides which projects to launch where and whether it is safe enough to deploy a team, even a local team?
Yeah, we're a very decentralized network. So if you think about, we have close to 7,000 people around the world. As I said, 95% of them are from the place where they're serving, and then they're really managed by the country office with local leadership of that country office in the majority of places, and then regional leadership. So we have a set of systems and processes that we use across the world on things like safety and security to make sure we have a set of standards and best practices, but we really do look to local decision making around things like when can we launch a humanitarian response in Syria? What are the parameters around that? How do we apply the best practices of our decades of experience and what we've learned around the world, but informed by deep local knowledge and experience? And I think that's the key to CARE's success, really.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. Has CARE examined the use of financial literacy programs or newer technologies like cryptocurrency to address economic inequality in countries? If so, what are some of the ways your organization sees this being effective or challenging to implement?
Yeah, great question. CARE is, I would say that in some sense our savings groups that I talked about, we're the largest coordinator of micro savings groups in the world. So that in of itself has many dimensions of financial literacy that are a part of that. Again, it's very localized. The curriculum is different in different places, but that is a part of, I would say, sort of our financial literacy work. We also are increasing, for instance, I think many of y'all may know that from a humanitarian perspective, in terms of emergency response, increasingly the distribution of cash is becoming the favored methodology to ensure that you are creating the most agency for those who are receiving the support and help. So they can decide what to do with their cash versus here's a blanket. Well, we already had a blanket. What we really needed was this. And so we have a variety of different dimensions of ways in which we use cash. And that means when I say cash, that can take a lot of different forms. We are actually just at the beginning of our journey around cryptocurrency. And I would say as I talk to students who are perhaps going to be expert or are expert in the sort of new modalities of cryptocurrency, we hope to be able to attract some great leadership and intellectual capital around this. It's hard for an organization like CARE to be on the cutting edge, or any nonprofit organization to be on the cutting edge of the utilization of that kind of technology. So I guess I'll turn the question into love any ideas and help around how we can build out our capacities there. We're piloting a program in Ecuador and in Kenya, and so we can report back shortly on that, but we definitely are at the beginning.
Michelle, could you explain a little bit more this savings program? There's there's a raging debate right now amongst researchers on the net benefit of the Grameen Bank microcredit program that Mohammed Yan has started and now has spread around. And there's critiques over the elevated interest rates and the societal pressures that are used for repayment. And then on the other side, you have some that are now saying that it's much better just to give money, the give direct groups. So how is the CARE program on women's savings programs similar and or different from these existing programs?
Yeah, well, CARE has had a long history and experience in what we call microcredit, which is the Muhammad Yunus model, and we over time have gravitated. We don't do so much of that. We do what we call this micro savings, which means that we are not actually infusing outside cash or creating high interest rates or say. This is basically a program where the savings is what's fueling the support of one another. Mm-hmm. So it is in that sense, less. It creates less risk around that sort of outside pressure, potentially putting people into debt, et cetera. That those are not the dimensions that we struggle with from the perspective of, again, the savings dimension of the program. I would say that the other piece of the savings program is that it becomes a kind of solidarity group. So financial literacy and inclusion and additional asset building and capacity for commercial credit, all of those things become a part of what's possible. But it is also a way in which, for instance, we work with smallholder farmers and infuse into the savings work that they're doing the opportunity for them to learn more about diversified, nutritious foods so that they can grow gardens that might enable their families to, again, have sustainable, nutritious food. We know that smallholder farmers are actually those who are the poorest in the world and often the most nutritionally deprived. So, and as I mentioned before, those platforms also become organizing platforms. So in Niger, there's a confederation of now tens of thousands of women that are part of these groups, and they're advocating and lobbying for change at a legislative level, as well as, again, running for office themselves. So it's sort of the financial inclusion is a beginning point, but it's not the end point of that work. And so I would say, I think on the direct cash, that's a different modality from either of those, either microcredit or micro savings. I think as I said, I think the give cash directly is a really interesting movement. I think it's, as in all of these things, I think they're all tools, but you do have to have a broader integrated approach because you have to look at systems change and a whole set of dimensions of sort of the enabling environment to ensure that you're actually giving families the capacity for long-term and sustained change. But especially in the humanitarian emergency response dimension, we are increasingly turning to cash.
Mm-hmm. You're generating a lot of questions, so this is good. The next questions, of all the challenges associated with underdevelopment, e.g. poverty, illiteracy, gender-based violence, environmental degradation, lack of access to amenities, etc., which challenges are nonprofits like CARE best positioned to address, and which are most difficult?
Oh my goodness, if I had the answer to that, I would be very wise indeed. Look, I think that I would answer in a couple of ways. One is that I think from a development perspective, what you find is that there's so much complexity and interdependence around some of those challenges, that they become inextricably linked to one another. And the more you peel back, the more you realize that you do have to take a kind of holistic look. And so while I do think that it makes sense to have nonprofits that are looking at what I would call sort of sectoral solutions. We're building wells, we're doing this. I think you also do need to make sure that you're thinking about your intervention and engagement as a nonprofit as a ecosystem within an ecosystem. And so CARE looks at, for instance, how are we supporting individual agency? How are we lifting people up to tackle their own problems? But also, what's the enabling environment or the community in which they're operating? And how do we help support the change that enables some of that longer term change? And then the systems change. So, I do think that there's real value in those more integrated, holistic, and systems-oriented change that takes into account scale change as well. I mean, the other dimension of the question is there are a number of things that work in very small scale, but if we as nonprofits are all, it's the what Habitat for Humanity problem that they talked about, and that I've heard my friend Jonathan Reckford talk about, in which you're building more and more houses, but the housing problem is getting worse at a macro level. So I think as nonprofits, we are challenged to take what we know about programmatic implementation and ensure that we are thinking about it from a governmental policy and societal perspective as well. Because otherwise, you can be working awfully hard on a hamster wheel in which things are actually getting worse around you. So that's a complicated answer to a tough question.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question from a student. You spoke about experiences and skill sets that students might seek. What about job experience or internships? What strategy should students use to enter into the career, even with the experiences and skill set that they have?
Yeah, well, I'm a huge fan of internships. I think that they can make a great deal of difference. And part of what they help equip people to do is understand what you do and don't want to do. If you have an internship in a small organization that's very grassroots, and then you work in a much larger organization, and you might work on the program side, and then you might work on the fundraising side, you start to see what you do and don't want to do. My first internship out of college was what I thought was preparing me for law school, and after 2 weeks, I realized, that's not going to be good for me. So, and I won't be good for it actually either. So. I think the opportunity to learn through internships what you're most excited about, in addition to building your resume, is really an important a part of the sort of equipping. And the other piece of that is that I also encourage people, you think everything has to be the sort of formal institutional, but just go out. And I know a lot of people that go and say, can I shadow you for a day? Not, whoever, I want to shadow a doctor, I want to shadow a don't be afraid to just ask questions of folks and just start to fill out your own sort of answers by expressing your intellectual curiosity and asking people to spend time with you. I think it's hard for people to say no to that.
Mm-hmm. Are there any issues or comments that you would like to make that we haven't asked any question on yet? Is there something that really inspires you to say?
I would say I do like to tell folks, because sometimes people talk about your leadership journey, and I think a lot of us don't self-identify in our younger years as leaders, and I just encourage people to give yourself time to find your voice, to make mistakes, to risk failure, all of those things that can seem intimidating, but if you start to build the resiliency around those things, and also to recognize that leaders aren't born. I really believe that they grow, and they come in a lot of different forms. And so, I encourage people to think about your own leadership journey, and especially being willing to take risks and risk failure. It's hard to do, but in small ways, if you each day, each semester, sort of think about, what am I going to do that I'm a little bit scared of? If you're not doing anything that's scaring you, or you think you might not be able to succeed, then probably not stretching enough.
Great. You mentioned that 95% of CARE's workforce is from the countries in which you have ongoing projects. How do you select the local workers? How do you ensure that these workers combine the requisite skills education as well as an understanding of the needs and aspirations of the target population?
Yeah, as I said, we have, let's just take a country office in Afghanistan as an example, or Haiti. We have a team of people that really does run as Care Haiti, Care Afghanistan, a huge amount of autonomy, definitely support from a financial perspective, from a human resource perspective, all sorts of ways in which we support, but they are creating and identifying the roles, the candidacies. There are, an extraordinary number of talented people everywhere in the world now, and to have the opportunity to meet some of the emerging and young people in places where CARE is working is an exercise in renewed optimism, I would say, as I talk to people around the world. So it's not so different from the same practices that we have here around how to identify great, smart candidates. And as I said, increasingly what we're looking for, the INGO model, historically, I would say 30, 40 years ago, we had a number of white men that were running our country offices in places around the world. And our goal now is that 80% of our country offices will be run by leaders from those, from that region or from that country. Now, we still have an international workforce, so somebody from India who has had multiple experiences in humanitarian response maybe goes to Afghanistan and helps lead that office. But we are very much looking towards the local talent and leadership who best understand the political context, the community needs, and can be responsive to those.
Okay. A very interesting question just popped up. NGO's difficult challenges with navigating the political context surrounding human challenges in difficult countries. And I'm reminded over the weekend there is a referee for a soccer game in England, and it was shown in Iran, and they went away from the casting of the soccer game 160 times so that the Iranians never saw the woman referee. So sometimes you have these difficult political issues as you're trying to do the best possible. So some NGOs believe in the importance of taking political positions that may directly challenge host government and leaderships. And how do you manage that minefield at a place like CARE?
Yeah, these are incredibly difficult questions. CARE is both a long-term development organization and a humanitarian organization. So we do apply the rules of humanitarian principles and leadership, which does demand neutrality and the alleviation of human suffering. That being said, in examples of, Yemen, for example, we work and have made a number of statements in partnership with INGOs and locally based Yemen civil society organizations that crisis will not be ended until there is a political solution to the conflict. And there are ways in which we take sides in the sense of we have lobbied the U.S. government along with others to cease to support, in this instance, Saudi Arabia in its continued use of U.S. weaponry, etc. So there is always a very, I think, difficult line to weave around when are you applying neutrality and when are you potentially aiding and abetting a political situation which is perpetuating suffering. And I don't think there are any easy answers, and we navigate it every day and in many, many different contexts. And I think making sure that we're asking ourselves the right questions is probably the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. I did some research on philanthropy in a really small neighborhood level with these really small locally led organizations in Brazil and Colombia. And they're like social circuses or some kind of sport group or theater groups, etc. And the biggest complaint that I heard from them was always that I'm a circus clown working with kids in a social circus, and someone gives me $10,000 and they want me to spend $8,000 of that and 300 hours of my time doing impact assessment that the people at MIT can't even do. And so it is really, they find it really demoralizing, and it has huge opportunity costs because they should be spending that time teaching girls to play badminton and not trying to figure out how to understand heteroskedasticity and all these other very difficult tasks. But they're burdened by them, and it seems to be like accepted best practice that these organizations with no training skills or desire must expend all of their time doing work that in the end is very bad, very poor data and not very useful. So I wonder how CARE thinks about this really thorny issue of impact assessment.
Yeah. Well, it is, I think it's difficult even for very large organizations to sometimes be able to meet the requirements of funders in terms of impact measurement. I mean, I think there is a way in which, again, there's a balance on all of this. I think you don't want to be doing things that are causing harm. You want to make sure that you have the capacity to measure those things that are most effective and successful, so you can do more of it. So I think finding the right ways of supporting, I think one of the things that is most difficult is when you ask nonprofits to deliver the service and evaluate it on the same dime. And so if you're going, I think we need to educate donors that if you want us to do the measurement evaluation, which I think most all of us want to be able to do at some level, then pay for it and enable us to do that. And it doesn't mean that we also necessarily even need to build it ourselves as much as pay for it and help us contract for it. And so I think those are some of the educational dimensions. I do think we have to push back when we are under resourced to do that work. And again, on the other hand, we do, I think, all want to be able to find the things that are most impactful and do more of them, and that does require us to know what's working.
Great. Well, on behalf of the Nunn School and the School of Public Policy and the Meg and Sam Flack speaker series, we want to really thank you. We know how busy you are. We really appreciate your time, and you have been extraordinarily generous, both of your time, but also with your candor and with your willingness to really speak out. We have one final question, and then we'll finish. What do you believe are the most important steps a nonprofit should take to be effective at accomplishing its mission in a sustainable way? We have a lot of students who start their own nonprofits and their own development projects. So what advice would you give them?
Well, I hate to end on a very prosaic note, but I will end in a very practical way, which is you have to have a plan to sustainably resource your ambition. So I think a lot of people fail to determine how it is that they're going to get the resources that are required to meet their goals and objectives, and a lot of nonprofits that fail as a result. So I guess that would be one dimension, and then maybe to be a little bit more on the aspiration side, I would say that the most important ingredients, I think, are the people that you're going to enlist. So whether if it's a very small, your board, your volunteers that are going to support you, and ensuring that you have a team of passionate, well-aligned, but diverse thinking, and people who really own the mission collectively to really, and to hold each other account to big ideas and big delivery of change in the world.
Well, thank you, Michelle, for a really a wonderful, exhilarating hour. And I hope our paths cross again.
My pleasure. And if anybody wants to intern or volunteer at CARE, you let us know.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Good luck, Kirk. Bye-bye.